One of the trends we're seeing this new generation of consoles is the arrival of visual updates for last generation games, basically new features designed to take advantage of more powerful hardware. Gears 5 just happens to be one of the first titles revealed receiving this sort of update, and along with the upcoming story DLC, it almost feels like a sort of soft relaunch. So what does this new version of Gears 5 offer? Well, for today's video, I had an opportunity to speak with two members from the Coalition, lending us some additional insight into the changes made to this version of the game. We've also had an opportunity to push the game through our frame rate analysis tools to see how closely it sticks to 60 FPS in the campaign with the new visuals, while also testing the 120 frames per second multiplayer. So let's jump into it. Released just last year, Gears 5 is one of the best looking games published by Microsoft on Xbox One, so it makes for a solid candidate to receive an update. It's basically a graphics and performance upgrade with some cool new features added in for good measure. So let's walk through some of the visual features and changes then, starting with resolution. In the campaign, Gears 5 still uses dynamic resolution scaling, but based on pixel counts of a variety of shots, it seems to average out around 1728p or so during normal gameplay, with native 4K popping up in less busy situations. The bottom though is still 1080p like One X, but it's rather uncommon as far as I can tell, a significant improvement over the Xbox One X version, which could drop to near 1080p in certain circumstances. The cutscenes also tend to show slightly lower resolutions overall, as based on the PC version, they're much heavier than the actual gameplay. Like this shot comes in at 1440p. Multiplayer is a little more aggressive with its DRS owing to the higher performance target, but it still looks really nice. Image quality was already good though, thanks to Unreal's temporal anti-aliasing, and it's improved thanks to a higher average resolution. Now, we don't have a Series S console yet, but we were told that that version maxes out at 1440p on the high end, suggesting an average resolution falling somewhere between Xbox One and Xbox One X, while still hitting the same frame rate targets and visual quality as Series X. In terms of detail levels then, the PC version served as a basis, with settings on Series X bumped up to the Ultra specification across the board. This means things like higher quality volumetric lighting, improved shadow detail, and more. This shot helps demonstrate the difference in volumetric lighting quality. You can see that the rays from the sun are more defined on Series X versus what we see here on Xbox One X. Subtle, but a nice improvement. This shot also shows the benefit of increased shadow quality. Notice how these window boxes cast shadows on Series X, but it's completely lacking any sort of detail over on the One X. This really helps a lot with distant shadow detail. The increase in detail is relatively subtle for the most part, but it leads to a more stable, solid looking game overall. Going back and forth between Xbox One X and Series X, you can see how the distant detail is more refined and sharper on the new machine. It holds up a lot better under close examination. Interestingly, bumping screen space reflections up greatly increases both the quality and number of surfaces using the effect. Many of these surfaces simply lacked screen space reflections on Xbox One X, and now they exist on Series X just as they did on PC. There was some confusion around this shot on social media in the last few weeks, but the PC reflections in this shot are actually using a higher end setting labeled Insane, which adds glossy reflections to the game. They're basically more realistic, but also more demanding, so I'm not surprised that it didn't make the cut. Now, Gears 5 does not currently make use of the velocity architecture features, but the nature of being installed to a fast SSD does mean that loading times are hugely improved. Loading times on the One X could take more than 45 seconds in most scenarios. This wasn't a huge deal if you were just playing through the game, as it streams as you play, but if you wanted to go from the main menu to the game, it could take a long time. On Series X, however, this is reduced to a mere fraction of the time, less than 10 seconds in most cases. A very nice boost that also made capturing comparison shots a lot more enjoyable. This might have been enough on its own, but the developers took time to implement some new features not previously available on PC as well, though they are coming to the PC version at a later date, I'm told. The big one here though is screen space global illumination. It's basically a ray tracer done in screen space, which takes care of global illumination. It was added to Unreal Engine 4 some time ago, and now it's been included in Gears 5. According to the Coalition, the GI pass is done at half resolution to save on resources, but it does use 8 rays per pixel. This is fine-grained enough to allow many things like even muzzle flashes or item pickups to contribute realistically to the lighting. This also naturally takes care of darker areas, places that were perhaps overly and unrealistically lit previously, now feature additional detail and shadow on Series X. Again, it's kind of subtle, but it's a neat step forward in creating more realistic lighting, and it looks great in this game. Unlike the March demo then, this is now coupled with more traditional screen space ambient occlusion, which takes care of the finer details. SSAO was previously featured on Xbox One X, but at a rather low quality, which led to obvious stippling patterns around objects. This is now gone on Series X. It's also worth noting that SSGI is only used during actual gameplay. The real-time cutscenes do not benefit from this feature. While we're looking at a cutscene, it's also worth mentioning that the Series X version features the much higher resolution textures available to PC users. This is most evident in close-ups of characters where you can see the new scratches in their armor and just a lot more detail all around. So basically, thus far, we have a game that's running with the PC Ultra settings along with Screen Space Global Illumination. But one of the more fascinating additions to this version of the game is actually variable rate shading. This isn't necessarily a visual thing though, it's something you shouldn't notice in practice, but it does help with performance. By varying shading precision in a scene, it basically allows for a higher average resolution. This visualization sent over by the team showcases VRS in action. Here, anything colored in red is being displayed at full shading resolution, while green indicates half resolution and yellow indicates either half horizontal or half vertical resolution. Impressively, it's not really something you'll notice during normal play, but having tinkered with Gears Tactics on the PC, which includes a somewhat noisy implementation of VRS, I was curious to know how they pulled it off. Well, apparently the changes are down to using what is known as Tier 2 variable rate shading. Gears Tactics uses Tier 1. What's the difference? Well, Tier 1 allows developers to specify the shading rate per draw call only, while Tier 2 allows for more granular control within each draw call. This basically allows for more precise control over which parts of the screen are adjusted. They use an edge detection filter to figure out the rate of shading based on the level of detail in each scene, and then it varies across the screen in a series of 8x8 tiles. In this case, I'm told that VRS saves basically 5 to 12% of rendering time per frame, which leads to a higher average resolution, making for a sharper looking game. Speaking of shaders, a lot of work was done to maximize the use of relaxed cone step mapping. This was also used in the original game and resembles parallax occlusion maps. Essentially, it adds proper depth to an otherwise flat texture. For the Series X version, the team spent months adding a ton of extra detail to each stage in the game. Depth right has also been enabled for cone step maps, meaning actual contact shadows in proper depth are now visible. It integrates these textures more naturally into the world. So yeah, these updates look great, but what's perhaps more important is the feel of the game. Using dynamic latency input, the team was able to greatly reduce input latency compared to the Xbox One X version. So here's the numbers that the team presented on this issue. It seems that latency is quite variable, but on average, it's much more responsive on Series X. My quick and dirty tests seemed to produce results in this region as well, but honestly, the difference was obvious straight away. The moment you move the analog stick and try to aim at an enemy, it just clicks. It feels a lot better. In fact, I really hope this focus on latency reduction becomes a common thing over the coming generation, as it just makes for more enjoyable gameplay. Of course, it's even lower when playing in multiplayer owing to the 120Hz update. Now obviously your mileage will vary somewhat based on the TV being used. Older HD TVs tend to exhibit noticeable input latency, but at least Gears 5 should feel more responsive to play overall. So the game looks nicer, and it plays better as a result of the reduced latency. But the frame rate is also an interesting thing to discuss, because, well, there's multiple things to test now. Normal 60Hz gameplay during the game's campaign, 120Hz gameplay during the game's multiplayer, and of course, variable refresh rate. Now unfortunately, I cannot easily demonstrate VRR in action, but I did finally have a chance to try it, and yeah, it's pretty effective. So where do we start? Well, I think the campaign is a good place to begin. Firstly, there's the cutscenes. On Series X, the team opted to increase the cutscene playback fluidity from 30 frames per second to 60 frames per second, leading to smoother overall cinematics. This change is in line with the PC version, which always offered high frame rate cutscene playback. And honestly, it looks really impressive overall, but it does highlight a small issue. On Xbox, the camera cuts exhibit 33 millisecond pauses, giving the impression of slight hitches during playback. Due to how this impacts the rendering, however, certain elements of the frame still change, such as the post-processing, so our tools cannot pick up this stutter, but to the eye, you might notice it. Apparently, this is down to the way in which the camera cuts work on Xbox One, and I'm told the team is testing a fix for the issue. It's not necessarily a huge deal, mind you, but I did find it slightly distracting since there was no such frame persistent issues on Xbox One due to the lower target frame rate of the cutscenes. But obviously, gameplay is more important overall. Now on Xbox One X, the game offers good performance. It targets 60 frames per second in both campaign and multiplayer, and it looks great, but it's not perfect and you will encounter tearing from time to time. But considering the visuals and the engine in use, it was an incredible feat for the Xbox One. Now on Series X, the overall experience is smoother, without the serious drops in combat or exploration, but unfortunately, that doesn't mean that everything is quite perfect. Basically, I spotted issues with traversal. These large open world-like stages that are used at various points in the game seem to exhibit stutters. You can see these issues on the graph. It manifests as an occasional long frame, basically 33 milliseconds instead of 16 milliseconds, which leads to the impression of stutter. So this was an odd one then. It didn't seem to be driven by the GPU or CPU necessarily, and running from the system's SSD shouldn't have been an issue either in terms of fetching data from storage. So what's going on? Well, I asked the developer about this problem, and it seems that this is a bug introduced with the interaction between the streaming system and the low latency optimizations. I was told that a fix is already in the works, however, so hopefully that will take care of this problem. We'll be sure to let you know on social media when it hits. But this also prompted me to test something else, variable refresh rate. Since I just upgraded to an LG CX OLED TV, I was able to test this feature and see how it impacts small performance dips like this. Well, it turns out VRR does save the day, and those hiccups are no longer visible by eye. Based on these results, I think it's going to become an important feature this generation, provided you have the TV to support it. Okay, but what about the game's multiplayer mode, which outputs at 120 Hz? Well, this one is perhaps both less interesting, yet more exciting. Basically, it works exactly as you'd hope. The graph is kind of boring. The game reaches the target 120 FPS and seems to just hold there most of the time. Now, I said boring, but this is actually great news for the player. It's really smooth. Now, there is a small caveat. I've only had a chance to play bot matches against the CPU, but technically that should be more demanding, I'd imagine, since it places additional strain on the system. But either way, the frame rate was locked most of the time, with only occasional minor hiccups. It feels dramatically better than 60 Hz too. 120 Hz could really become a huge deal for fast-paced multiplayer games this generation, I'd imagine. So overall, the report on performance is pretty good. There are still some hiccups with the game's performance, of course, but it sounds like the development team has figured them out, and hopefully, they should be solved in the future. Now, the last part of the performance equation is, of course, the split screen mode, specifically split screen during the campaign. As you can see, well, this mode still runs at 30 frames per second, just as it did on Xbox One X. It plays fine enough, but it is a little disappointing as I feel that 60 FPS split screen would have been a really nice addition. That said, from what I understand, the decision was made to keep visual parity between the single player mode and the split screen mode, and there probably just wasn't enough juice left to get to a full 60 in up to 3-player split screen. Still, because the game is limited to 30 frames per second, that means that the average resolution is actually higher, so it's very sharp in this mode. And if you play on a big TV, you really have a lot of screen real estate to play around with, so it works really well. So that's basically where we're at right now with this game. The update for Gears 5 is a nice boost for an already beautiful game. It doesn't really change any of the core game design, of course. If you weren't a fan of the game, it really won't change anything, but if you were a fan, you'll probably enjoy this even more, and I do think it's worth replaying. The visual improvements are excellent, and it just feels better all around. I love the new lighting, improved shadows, increased detail, and smoother overall frame rate. These are all great changes. Plus, Gears 5 still features one of the best HDR implementations out there. The only thing that remains at this point is to see how the game runs on the Series S. It sounds like it'll have all the visual features of the Series X version, just rendered at a lower resolution, but we'll have to test it and see. But that's going to do it for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed and have a better understanding of what this new version of the game offers for players on Series X. Just as I'm finishing this, there's a lot more next generation content coming online, so look out for a ton more videos in the coming weeks. But for now, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to let us know by liking, subscribing, ringing the notification bell, and following us on Twitter. And until next time, this is John, signing off.